Hey, Mr. Murphy here. I'm going to go through the light-independent, or Calvin cycle, part of photosynthesis. So just as a quick recap, here we have a chloroplast, and inside of that chloroplast on the left-hand side we have the stack of thylakoids, which is called a granum. And that's where the light-dependent side was happening, where, just as a quick recap, we took in light and H2O, we made the byproduct oxygen, thankfully, and also managed to charge up two energy-carrying molecules or electron carriers called ATP and NADPH. Now those molecules were then shipped off where they're going to be used by the Calvin cycle to sort of finish the process. So what's happening here in the Calvin cycle is that using the energy of ATP and NADPH, it's capturing carbon dioxide and producing glucose. And that glucose then can go on to form sugars like sucrose or polysaccharides like starch. So if you think like a potato is made of these long branching starch molecules, and that's made of a ton of glucose. So it's a lot of photosynthesis happening in a potato plant that's then producing the potato itself. So looking at this more closely on the Calvin cycle, it's a lot. At first, it seems that way. It's not actually nearly as complicated as this diagram seems. And so I'm just going to run through sort of the big steps, and that's the important part. So if you look at the top, you see carbon dioxide coming in. And that carbon dioxide is being captured using the help of this enzyme called rubisco. And it's forming this 6-carbon molecule. And then every arrow throughout here is basically a chemical reaction that's happening. And the reason why that happens is because what we want to make is glucose. What we have is a bunch of carbon dioxide and then these 5-carbon molecules, whatever. The point is we want to restructure this thing in order to make the product that we actually want. So what's happening with each one of these chemical reactions is the shape of this molecule is being tweaked and changed. Phosphate groups are being moved around, oxygens and hydrogens are being moved around, and some of that requires energy. And that doesn't come from light, it comes from the energy-carrying molecules or electron carriers that we produced in the light-dependent side. So again, that's ATP and NADPH. And so what's happening then is we're changing the shape, changing the shape, changing the shape until we make these G3P molecules. And what happens is every cycle, one of those molecules sort of escapes the cycle or leaves the cycle. And so that's a 3-carbon molecule coming off. And so what that means is every 2 cycles of the Calvin cycle produces 2 of these G3Ps, which then go on to form our glucose. And so the Calvin cycle is able to produce our glucose by undergoing this series of chemical reactions. It's many steps. It is complicated. We don't need to memorize those steps, but the important part is that we understand that it's using the energy from the light-dependent side, which we previously saw, in order to change around the shape of this molecule and produce that glucose. So that's the Calvin cycle in a nutshell. I suppose one last thing we should mention is when we use those energy carriers, we then produce, ATP turns into ADP, sort of the like dead battery version of ATP, and NADPH turns into NADP+, and those then get sent back to the light-dependent side where the plant can use the sunlight in order to charge them back up, and the cycle continues. So it's actually really clean. In the end, we've taken in CO2 and we have produced glucose. So there you go. Hope that helped.